Daniel Levitis is a writer, researcher, and expert on the subject of white supremacist and neo-Nazi organizations. His clients include the U.S. Department of Justice, the Bureau of Prisons, the Government of Canada, American Airlines, the City of Cincinnati, and many others, all of who have come to him for his expert knowledge in such areas as the Ku Klux Klan, the Skinhead Movement, the Aryan Nations, white racist prison gangs, cross-burning, and hate-motivated violence. Mr. Levitis served as Executive Director of the Atlanta-based Center for Democratic Renewal and Education, Incorporated, where in addition to his managerial responsibilities, he supervised and conducted research on the activities of known hate groups and forms of hate activity. Mr. Levitis has conducted training sessions and seminars on these topics for public officials, community leaders, and law enforcement officers throughout the United States. Mr. Levitis is the author of many articles and publications on the activities of white supremacist hate groups and has been cited as an expert on hate-based organizations by the New York Times, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Chicago Tribune, and the Wall Street Journal, just to name a few. He has appeared on various national news programs, contributed to handbooks and encyclopedias, and is the author of the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award nominated book, The Terrorist Next Door, which he's here to talk to us about today. In this book, Mr. Levitis reminds us that while the terrorist threat from abroad is at the forefront of our thoughts, the danger of the paramilitary right here in the United States is still clear and present. The Terrorist Next Door traces the emergence of white supremacist paramilitary groups from their roots in the post-Civil War era through the segregationist violence of the Civil Rights era to the present day. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Daniel Levitis.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the History and Politics Club for sponsoring my appearance here today, and especially also extending my recognition to the Lyceum Committee, and thanks also to Student Government for also supporting my talk with you. As noted, I'm an Atlanta resident, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here close to home, in fact, a DeKalb County resident to be more precise. I'm not here to frighten you, as Professor King might have noted. I'm not here to instill fear in people's hearts, but I do want to draw attention to a dual reality and really a challenge that we're faced with. On the one hand, the very real threat of domestic terrorism from citizens here in this country, not from theologically inspired mass murderers abroad, but from those who are theologically inspired here at home to attack Jews, to attack blacks, to attack government officials, to commit crimes such as those we saw in 1995 when Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City Federal Building. So on the one hand, I want to draw your attention to that issue, and I'll be talking more about it. But in a more important sense, in a larger sense, I want to point out what I think is a more significant danger, that of the corrosive effects of increasing anti-Semitism, rising anti-Arab and anti-Muslim bigotry in the United States, increasing fear and hatred of foreigners. That these, at the end of the day, are the larger threats, the greater challenges, and indeed the more intractable problems. Because on the one hand, while we can and should treat the domestic terrorists of the paramilitary right as the law enforcement problem that they are, on the other hand, you can't root out bigotry and prejudice simply by passing legislation. There's no way to make a law to ensure that people are more tolerant than others. And I think definitely, as you'll see from some of the statistics I'm going to share with you today, that the evidence is quite clear that we are in and are entering a period of increasing racial, ethnic, and religious tension that has some deep-rooted sources that are feeding it. And as our history has shown, those are never good times for all of America, not just the minority groups that end up being targeted. the attacks of September 11th focused appropriately everybody's attention on the dangers from al-Qaeda. And I'm not here to minimize the threat of Wahhabism. That's the theology that is adhered to by Osama bin Laden. It's not the theology of 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. It's the theology of perhaps several hundred, at most, Muslims throughout the world. And not all Muslims who adhere to Wahhabism, that sect of Islam that is followed and promoted by Osama bin Laden, are terrorists like Osama bin Laden. But I'm not here to minimize that threat. It's a real threat. It's a significant danger. In fact, it's a greater threat to Muslims throughout the world than indeed it is to us, because the foremost target of Osama bin Laden and his followers is actually not the United States in a larger political and religious sense. Their foremost target are the forces of moderate Islam that do not embrace their murderous intentions. You didn't come here to hear a disquisition about Osama bin Laden, so I'll stop there. But I want the record to be clear that in no way, shape, or form am I minimizing my concerns. But at the same time as we were focused on the threat from abroad, domestic hate groups here in the United States were scheming as to how to turn the situation to their advantage, even as the World Trade Center towers were collapsing on September 12th. We had members of the neo-Nazi group, the World Church of the Creator, sending email messages out to their supporters which said the following: "Wonderful news, brothers. Maybe as many as 10,000 Zogites are dead." Zogite, that's a right-wing neo-Nazi term referring to the supposed Zionist-occupied government of the United States. Because you see, in the paranoid worldview of the Aryan nations and others on the radical right, the government of the United States is controlled by a secret international Jewish conspiracy, which in fact runs the world. There are 7 billion people on the planet. Last time I checked, there's only about 15.2 million Jews. 15.2 million Jews. Jews make up only 2.2% of the population in the United States, less than 6 million out of 280 million. I don't think there's a Jewish conspiracy that's running the United States. I don't think there's a Jewish conspiracy prosecuting the war against Iraq any more than I think that there's an African-American conspiracy prosecuting the war against Iraq simply because Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice are prominent members of the administration. But nevertheless, in the minds of the radical right, it's a Jewish conspiracy that runs the world. It's Zog, the Zionist-occupied government. And so in this email, he said, "Maybe as many as 10,000 Zogites are dead. The war is upon us all. Time to get shooting, lone wolves. September 11th is a wonderful day. Let's kick some Jew ass." Now, if this was simply the ranting of a lone individual without any history or context, we would have reason enough to be concerned. After all, it was an email sent out to hundreds of people on September 12th while the World Trade Center towers are burning. He's saying, get your gun. But this group, there's a context to it. The World Church of the Creator, it's a white supremacist organization. It's been around for decades. It's a rather small group. It doesn't have thousands and thousands of followers, but it has a history of violence and murder associated with it. Some of you might remember 4th of July, 1999, one of the followers of this group, a college student, like maybe some of you here in this room, 21 years old. His name was Benjamin Nathaniel Smith. He grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, which is an uptown suburb of Chicago. His father was a pathologist. His mother was a real estate agent. She was a member of the $1 million sales club of her local realty company. Successful, white, upper-middle-class family. 4th of July, 1999, this kid goes out, loads his car with weapons and ammunition. He starts by shooting Orthodox Jews in Rogers Park in Chicago. Then he sees Ricky Birdsong walking down the street with his 2 teenage daughters. Ricky Birdsong was the former basketball coach, Northwestern University, African-American. Shoots him dead right there in the street in cold blood. Goes driving around shooting at Asians, anybody who looks non-white. Then he disappears. Then he drives further through Illinois the next day, sees a black man standing on his porch. Shoots him, wounds him. Luckily, he doesn't kill him. Then he goes driving around. He goes to Bloomington, Indiana. The police still can't track this person down, still don't know who's doing this. 4th of July weekend, 1999. And he shoots and kills a young Korean-American student going to Methodist church services on Sunday morning. By the time the police close in on him, after 3 days, he kills himself. And the leader of the group, the World Church of the Creator, says, there's 2 people dead, 9 people wounded, and the leader of the group says, as far as I'm concerned, our losses were 1 white man. So this organization, the World Church of the Creator, and by the way, just last month, its leader, Matthew Hale, was indicted in Chicago for allegedly soliciting the murder of a federal judge. So this email is going out on September 12th from their Pittsburgh coordinator, a young man named Hardy Lloyd. He's saying, time to get your gun, time to start shooting. His reference to lone wolves, that's exactly the tactic that was pursued by Benjamin Nathaniel Smith. You know, there was a time when those on the radical right had delusions of forming revolutionary cells of 10 or 20 armed men that would go out and rob banks and commit political acts to destabilize the government of the United States. And in their fantasies, they're not going to realize their fantasies, but they're dangerous fantasies nonetheless. In their fantasies, they would help bring about white racist revolution in America through this form of kind of guerrilla warfare. Well, we had a group like this in the early 1980s called the Order. And they started by robbing an armored car outside Ukiah, California. It was the largest armored car heist in the history of the United States, $3.1 million. The money has never been found. It turns out the money was distributed widely to neo-Nazis and haters all across the country. How do we know this? Because one of the members of this group was arrested. Actually, I don't know if any of you remember this. He was arrested in Roswell, Georgia. And he gave a 30-page confession to the FBI, which he later recanted, wherein he described how all of this money was given to all of these white supremacist groups across the country. And the white supremacist movement learned from that experience. This group called the Order had about 24 people involved. And after they robbed the armored car and after they killed Alan Berg, he was a Jewish talk show host in Denver. Some of you might recall that incident. Very prominent and you know, combative talk show personality who was always criticizing bigots on the air. They didn't like him, so they killed him one day in the carport of his home, riddled his body with bullets. After those incidents happened, the FBI managed to infiltrate the organization, tap the phones, track them down. Their leader was killed. But that experience, this was 20 years ago, taught the radical right, you know, if we're going to go out there and do these things and commit these crimes and try and destabilize the government and commit and bring about white revolution, don't tell all your friends what you're going to do. Don't get half a dozen people involved in your group in an organized fashion because maybe one of them's a Fed. So go out and be a lone wolf. Hence the reference in this email, time to get shooting lone wolves. Well, when I got this email message, needless to say, I was alarmed. So I called the head of the domestic terrorism unit of the FBI in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and got through directly to the individual. And I pointed out that the World Church of the Creator has a long-standing record of racist violence, and that, in fact, it has been labeled by the FBI as a domestic terrorist group. Now, of course, when you talk to the FBI, they don't have to confirm or deny anything. They can say, thank you very much, hang up the phone. They might have known everything there was to know about Hardy Lloyd, who was sending this email. But as was noted in the introduction, I've participated in prosecutions by the Justice Department of hate group members in which the FBI is involved. And I'm familiar with the FBI and how they operate. And I can tell you just on my instinct and based upon that phone call that the individual who I was talking to had absolutely no idea who Hardy Lloyd was or what the World Church of the Creator was up to. And you can bet your bottom dollar that if I had been calling the domestic terrorism unit of the Pittsburgh office of the FBI on September 12th saying, You know, there's an imam down at the local mosque who happens to have sent the following email to his followers saying, time to get your gun, that there would have been about 20 FBI agents and half a dozen squad cars screeching down there in about 15 minutes, and the place would have been ransacked and the computer would have been hauled back for analysis. As a matter of fact, I'm very disturbed that right now in the current climate, the FBI has been given instructions by John Ashcroft, by the Justice Department. Every FBI office in the United States has been told to develop a list of the total number of mosques and Muslims in each FBI office jurisdiction. Now, how that kind of broad brush, scattershot approach is going to pinpoint sleeper cells of Al-Qaeda, you know, or other Islamic fundamentalist terrorists in the United States is absolutely beyond me. The only thing that that is going to accomplish is, A, divert FBI resources from actually pinpointing and focusing on the real terrorist threat, and secondly, it's going to make people in the Islamic community and in the Arab American community who might perhaps want to come forward with information that they might know about people so upset and angry at the government from having been unfairly persecuted and unfairly targeted that some of them may say, you know, I don't know if I really want to cooperate with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, I know that the FBI is trying to do the best job that it possibly can, but my experiences around the Oklahoma City bombing tell me that we have a long way to go. Because the truth of the matter was that up until the point at which Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, don't forget there were two people involved that we know of in that crime. McVeigh's been executed. Nichols is now still facing 168 murder charges in Oklahoma courts, and he may well end up receiving the death penalty there. That prior to the Oklahoma City bombing, the FBI was really asleep at the switch when it came to understanding these far-right neo-Nazi and paramilitary movements in the United States. Some of you might even remember that the pronouncements right in the wake of Oklahoma City were that this had the clear hallmark of Middle Eastern terrorists, right? That these are the only kind of people who would commit cold, bloodthirsty acts of mass murder and kill women and children with car bombs while they're all over in the Middle East. Well, the person responsible for that was anything but. He was a Gulf War veteran, Timothy McVeigh. And he was inspired in the construction of his bomb, that fuel oil and fertilizer explosive mixture that blew up the Ryder rental van there, resulting in so much destruction. He was inspired to construct that kind of bomb by a man named William Pierce, the leader, up until his death last summer, of a neo-Nazi group called the National Alliance. Now, in 1978, William Pierce wrote a book. Maybe some of you have heard about it. It's called The Turner Diaries. It's a race war, futuristic race war fantasy novel. Again, it was written in 78 about how in the 1990s a group of white supremacists called the Order get together and in response to gun control blow up the headquarters of the FBI with a fuel oil and fertilizer bomb, and then go on through guerrilla warfare to rob banks to finance their white supremacist revolution, and ultimately end up blowing up the Pentagon with a 60-kiloton nuclear bomb. And in this fantasy novel, white Aryanism prevails and the entire planet is cleansed of anybody non-white. This book is sold, we don't really know reliably, but the figures that we do have, and I think it's an underestimate, more than 250,000 copies, 250,000 copies. And it's this book that it inspired this earlier group I mentioned, the Order, in the 1980s. They took their name from the book. And when Timothy McVeigh was found hours after the Oklahoma City bombing, they didn't nab him through good police work. There was an alert Oklahoma highway patrolman who saw him driving down the road, and there was no license plate on the back of his Mercury Marquis. And when the Oklahoma highway patrolman went and looked into the vehicle with McVeigh there at the wheel, he noticed there was a gun in the car. And then suspicion started to escalate, so he took McVeigh in. And McVeigh was sitting in a jail cell, in Oklahoma for hours before there was any suspicion that he was connected with the bombing. Well, in that car, there was an envelope with Xerox pages from what book? from the Turner Diaries, the same book in which the author, William Pierce, described the creation of this fuel, oil, and fertilizer bomb. And William Pierce was no dummy. He was an assistant professor of physics at Oregon State University. He knew what the proper recipe for a fuel, oil, and fertilizer bomb was, and he put it in the Turner Diaries in the hopes that he would inspire people like McVeigh. In a larger historical sense, one of the points I want to bring forward to you is to answer the question kind of why. Why is it that individuals like McVeigh or groups like the National Alliance, and just as an aside, there is a unit of this group, the National Alliance, here in Georgia. They're up in Dahlonega. They're constantly, not constantly, but they've been parading around organizing meetings in Gainesville. Doing what? Protesting the Latino population and the immigrant population in North Georgia. They're not getting recruits walking through the streets in bed sheets, waving nooses or brandishing swastikas. They go out and get recruits by talking to people about their fears and their concerns and their skewed kind of racist perceptions about people who are different than them coming into their community. Thankfully, one of the leaders of this group in Dahlonega, you might have seen it in the paper just about 2 weeks ago, was arrested as a felon for illegal possession of firearms. So maybe he's off the street now. But how is it that groups like the National Alliance, that I've mentioned, have adopted this revolutionary philosophy? Because organizations like this, white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi groups, they call themselves patriots. They claim to embrace the Constitution. Well, part of the story that I tell in my book, and from a historical perspective, I think it's important for us to recognize, is that there was a time in this country, I might say not so long ago, it may seem like ancient history to many of you, but let's say 50 years ago certainly, where the ideas of white supremacy and the notion that America was a white Anglo-Saxon Christian nation were in fact the dominant ideology of this nation. And that the somehow we might perceive these as fringe, kind of crazy, distorted concepts when we hear the rantings and the ravings of Hardy Lloyd and others. But they have succeeded, and they continue to succeed because they draw on a wellspring of deeper belief. And it's my thesis, as I describe in the book, that many of these events that we're currently seeing with regard to domestic terrorism on the radical right, or much of their rhetoric, is really linked to the struggles of 50 years ago, beginning, in fact, in 1948 with President Harry Truman's integration of the armed forces, followed 6 years later by the Brown decision, May 17, 1954, which declared separate but equal unconstitutional. We fought a civil war in this country to end slavery, and after slavery there was a thing called Reconstruction, where we tried to rebuild the South along the lines of the promise offered in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, that people would be treated equal without regard to race, and that and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, that the badges and indicia of slavery would all be removed. We attempted this in Reconstruction, and Reconstruction failed as a political experiment. And by 1878, the South was given back over to the same forces of white supremacy, albeit no longer with slavery functioning as an institution. But the same forces of white supremacy ruled the South. And in 1896, the Supreme Court declared that separate but equal was constitutional. And it took from 1896 all the way to 1954 for us to finally, as a nation, to begin to reverse that trend. And when you look at Truman's integration of the Army in 48, when you look at the Brown decision in 54, when you look at the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, what you see is that finally, by that time, by the mid-60s, the government of the United States was taking some concrete steps to eliminate de jure segregation, segregation by law. And those millions and millions of Americans, South and North, who still believed in the integrity of white supremacy, found their world turned upside down. Now, a majority of them came to some uncomfortable or comfortable adjustment with it, and thankfully the world that we live in today is not the world of 1948. But for a small number of white supremacists and white people in general, there has been mounting resentment and mounting anger that the government has become an agent of racial equality and racial egalitarianism. Now, I think that the government is far from completing that task of really ensuring racial equality. After all, we have a presidential administration that has filed a brief with the U.S. Supreme Court arguing against affirmative action, which ironically was an initiative of a Republican president back in 1973. Richard Nixon was the first political figure to enact affirmative action by executive order. So we have a long way to go. Nonetheless, those on the radical right, the hatred for the federal government, it's not, oh, I don't like paying taxes. It's not, oh, I just don't like big central government telling me what to do. It is a hatred that is derived from the notion that all that is good and positive in the United States is created through race and by white people, and that when the federal government does anything to degrade the racial integrity of the nation, it has become the cultural and political enemy of white people. Hence the belief that the government is somehow acting as the hidden hand of an international Jewish conspiracy. That is one of the reasons why Senator Trent Lott's remarks endorsing Strom Thurmond were so significant. Because here was a man, arguably the second most powerful individual in the country, Senate Majority Leader, saying that things would have been better off had Strom Thurmond been elected president. This is the platform of the States' Rights Democratic Party. Let me read from it to you briefly, because this is the platform on which Strom Thurmond ran for president. These are the principles which Trent Lott was saying America would have been better off had these principles come to pass. Quote, "We stand for the segregation of the races and the racial integrity of each race. The constitutional right to choose one's associates. We oppose the elimination of segregation. We oppose the repeal of miscegenation statutes or race-mixing statutes. And we oppose the control of private employment by federal bureaucrats called for by the misnamed Civil Rights Program. We favor home rule, local self-government, and a minimum interference with individual rights." I want you to focus on the first part and the last part of this element of the platform. The first part is starkly racist and bigoted in its declarations. We stand for segregation, we stand for opposing race mixing, so on and so forth. But the last part is dressed up in traditional principles of Americanism. I mean, after all, who would be opposed to individual rights? Who would be opposed to home rule, local self-government? These are central principles of representative democracy. And white supremacists and racists and anti-Semites and bigots, as I've mentioned, their success, yes, there's a small number of them that emulate Hitler and like to parade around like cartoon Nazis, but these people aren't stupid. There are people in this movement, in the hate movement, with PhDs. They're smart enough. This group, the National Alliance, was pulling in more than $1 million a year in sales of neo-Nazi music on CDs, racist skinhead music. They have about a dozen skinhead kids up in their compound in West Virginia working 8-10 hours a day, putting out a glossy magazine promoting resistance records. You know, they're running a business enterprise, selling hate music, financing their movement, and so on and so forth. And they know that in order to promote a message, to reach a large portion of the population, that you have to dress these ideas and ideologies up in the traditional language of Americanism. One of the groups I write about, which I spent many years researching, the so-called Posse Comitatus. It's Latin for power of the county. This is a group that was the progenitor of the militia movement. Its leader, William Potter Gale, he was a former lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, a very successful businessman. He, on the one hand, promoted the bigoted, hateful theologies of his religion, which it was called Christian identity. There was nothing Christian about it. He said Jews were the children of Satan, white Anglo-Saxons were the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and black people were mud people. They were mistakes by God. On the one hand, he promoted this virulent racism, but on the other hand, he talked about the Constitution and Christian common law and how America was founded on these central principles where race and the law were inseparable. And it was a message that spoke to the very kind of American political and legal ideals of quite a few of the followers that he attracted. Well, why is it significant, again, returning to this platform and talking about Trent Lott? I mean, this is a platform which is boldly racist on its face, and yes, thankfully, Trent Lott was deposed from his position as Senate Majority Leader. But last time I checked, Bob, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he's chair of the Senate Rules Committee, which is the most powerful committee, short of the Budget Committee, in the United States Senate. It's the committee which decides what legislation goes to the floor and what doesn't. And the question that I have for Trent Lott and for the political leaders of this country is why Trent Lott wasn't deposed from that position in 1999. 3 years before he made his Trent Lott report, it was news in the New York Times that Trent Lott was palling around and endorsing, and indeed was no less than an honorary member of a group called the Council of Conservative Citizens. This group publishes this newsletter called the Citizens Informer. Council of Conservative Citizens was founded in Atlanta in 1985. It's the descendant of the old Citizens Council movement that started in 1954 to fight the Brown decision and to fight integration. You know what these folks said after September 11th? You know who they blamed September 11th on? Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. How'd they blame September 11th on Abraham Lincoln? Well, you see, Abraham Lincoln ended slavery. Abraham Lincoln promoted race mixing. Race mixing is the cause of America's cultural and moral and economic decline. Once you have race mixing, you have multiculturalism. Once you have multiculturalism, you let all these different-looking people into the country. Once you let these different-looking people into the country, they get on planes with box cutters and they destroy the World Trade Center. I don't know how you get from Abe Lincoln to Al-Qaeda, but they somehow managed to do so. But, you say this is a fringe idea. What business does Senator Trent Lott have going to groups like this, speaking in front of them in Mississippi? Now, granted, he did this before September 11th, but the group was as crazy in its character then as it was post-September 11th, and saying, the Council of Conservative Citizens stands for the right principles and the right values that we need in America. That's a quote of Senator Trent Lott. Well, that was a one-week story in the New York Times that Trent Lott had some connection with the Council of Conservative Citizens. He denied it all, even though there were photographs of him speaking in front of this group and recorded statements, that I've just quoted to you. And, it passed over as a one-week news story. Well, no wonder why he went and stuck his foot in his mouth at the Strom Thurmond birthday bash, because he figured, if he got away with that, he could get away with anything. These ideas may, again, seem to exist on the fringe, but unfortunately, they are shared by far many more Americans. Let me talk to you briefly about anti-Semitism, then I'm going to talk about anti-Arab bigotry and xenophobia. I want you to imagine that you're at, let's say, the Politics and History Club, and you got a new student who's coming to join, and you hear them talking in the back. And I want you to think, at what point do you conclude that this student is an anti-Semite, that this student has got a problem with Jewish people? And I want you to think about this, and I want you to raise your hand at the point at which you conclude that the person saying these things is an anti-Semite, okay? And you don't have to be premature. There's no correct answer to this. I just want to see your show of hands, and keep it up at the point at which, you still think this person is an anti-Semite. And they say, well, Jews, they have too much power in America today, and they always like to be at the head of things. And the Jews, they run the banks and they run Wall Street. Keep your hands up at the point at which you think it. And, Jews, they just don't care about what happens to anyone else but their own kind. And you know those Jews, they're just shady businessmen. You can't cut a deal with them. They're just going to rip you off. For those of you whose hands are up, I have to inform you that that person is not considered an anti-Semite, according to the poll data that I'm about to share with you. Because I thought you accepted diverse viewpoints. In order to be classified as an anti-Semite, according to this poll, you have to answer 6 or more of these 11 questions in order to be considered an anti-Semite. And it's a conservative scale. I'm not arguing with it, but I'm here to tell you that 30 to 35 million Americans answer yes to 6 or more of these questions. That is 17% of the adult population. 35 million adult Americans. That's as many black people as there are in this country. If I stood here and told you what the black community thinks about politics or how they vote, it's irrelevant. You'd laugh me off the stage. 35 million Americans. That's about equivalent to the number of elderly that there are in the country. If I told you, the elderly vote, what they think is irrelevant, you'd laugh me off the stage. Well, thankfully, anti-Semites don't vote as a bloc, but 30 to 35 million people, 17% of the adult population, and I'm not counting the folks who are answering 4 or more of these questions in the affirmative. I mean, imagine if you were standing next to someone and they said, well, black people are lazy and shiftless. Black people are essentially criminal. Black people are essentially inferior to white people. Well, all they're good at is sports and music, but not much else. They haven't produced any decent pieces of literature. I mean, these are the same kinds of bigoted and racist stereotypes about Jewish people. And sadly, when you look at the conventional polling data, racism in America is worse than anti-Semitism. I don't have the most recent polling data in front of you because there's so much of it, so extensive. If you're interested in looking at it, I recommend a book to you called Racial Attitudes in America, edited by Lawrence Bobo at Harvard University, who's one of the foremost sociologists in this field, an African-American himself, who's got great charts and graphs which show that even though racism certainly declined, that we're not living in 1948 anymore, the issue is not, in my opinion, whether or not a majority of people are going to go join the National Alliance or join the Order or, that America is going to be taken over by Nazis. That's not the point. The point is, do these points of view exist among a significant plurality of the population sufficient to affect the tone and texture and nature of democracy? Look at anti-Arab and anti-Islamic bigotry. After September 11th, more than a third of adults in America who were polled said that we should take adult Muslim men and put them in security camps. We tried that once before with Japanese Americans. We know what a failure that was. We ended up apologizing, as we should have appropriately, and paying reparations to the Japanese American community, symbolic reparations more than any substantive reparations, in fact. And yet, still, after that experience, more than a third, the numbers probably declined. Well, now that there's a war going on in Iraq, it's hard to say. I haven't seen the recent polls. I think people are kind of afraid to ask the question. I mean, Gallup polled on it earlier, and Newsweek and Time polled on it right after September 11th, but maybe with good reason they're not continuing to ask that question again, because when you report those results, they're extraordinarily disturbing. When you look at anti-foreigner attitudes towards immigrants, instead of people believing what I believe to be is the truth, that immigrants have driven the economic engine of this country, that they're driving the economic engine of this country now, that the kind of ethnic and linguistic diversity that we see, you talk about here in DeKalb County. When you drive down Buford Highway, you see the new immigrant populations of Asians and all other kind of immigrant communities, people who've come here fleeing repression, fleeing war, the Bosnian community and others, and of course the Latino community. These folks are hardworking, they're driving the economy, they're contributing to America, and they're going to be the people whose children make up the majority-minority by the year 2050, when America no longer is a majority white nation. And we've got to find some way to positively express and embrace what immigrant diversity means in this country instead of fanning the flames of fear and paranoia. Unfortunately, groups like American Immigration Control Foundation, and I could read off a whole host, a list to you of groups, and political pundits like Pat Buchanan, or I don't know if you've heard Mike Savage. If you want to really be offended, his book is the #2 book on the New York Times bestseller list. Mike Savage. It's called Savage Nation. Don't read it. Just go to Barnes & Noble and look at 5 pages. That's all you need to do. He's recently been signed as a commentator for MSNBC. He makes Pat Buchanan's racism and bigotry, he makes Pat Buchanan look like Mr. Rogers. I mean, this is a man, he calls for, the execution of illegal immigrants and undocumented workers. He says gay and lesbian people don't deserve to live. He talks about a brown tide of glop that's invading America. And, he is on the airwaves. 10 years ago, we were concerned about the hate rhetoric of Rush Limbaugh, and now the bar has been moved even further and further to the right. So, on the one hand, in this current environment, we do have people on the paramilitary right who are domestic terrorists. They're talking about how to make ricin and how to brew anthrax. Anthrax is more difficult, and I don't think they were behind the October 2001 anthrax attacks. But any of you could leave this lecture right now, go home, get on the internet, and download the recipe for how to make ricin. It's a biotoxin derived from castor beans. It's 6,000 times more deadly than cyanide. And groups on the radical right, like several members of an organization called the Minnesota Patriots Council, they've brewed ricin, and they were going to use it to go kill some law enforcement officers that they didn't like. Luckily, they didn't get around to doing it because a disgruntled girlfriend, or I think it was a spouse, ratted them out and took the coffee can of ricin down to the local sheriff's department and said, hey, looky here, this is what he was getting ready to do. But recently you might have seen a news report that police in London, an anti-terror squad, uncovered ricin in an apartment that was supposedly linked to Al-Qaeda. So you got, terrorists, Islamic fundamentalist terrorists, making ricin, allegedly. You've got guys on the radical right brewing ricin. They are saying every day on their websites that they are opposed to the government of the United States. Most, but not all, of these groups are opposed to the war in Iraq because they say it as and you can have any kind of position or opinion about the war in Iraq, pro or con. I'm not critical of that. I have my own concerns and criticisms of this military adventurism. However, their opposition to the war in Iraq is grounded in a belief that it's a Jewish conspiracy. And we had just a month or so ago in Washington State a member of the Washington National Guard, an intelligence officer who had top secret military clearance. Now, you don't normally think about the National Guard being a security leak, but if you have top secret military clearance and access to a computer, you can download a lot of stuff. You can get a lot of information. Well, this guy was indicted just last month, he and his wife, who were both linked to the Aryan nations and white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups, for they had 15 boxes of information, it hasn't been found yet, on chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare, and at least the indictment and what has been testified to at trial in Spokane is that their intention was to take this information and sell it to militia groups across the United States. So, on the one hand, we have the real and concrete threat of domestic terrorism by people who are inspired by white supremacy, by anti-Semitism, by hatred of immigrants, to go out and kind of do what they want to do. But on the other hand, in my view, the greater and more significant danger and more significant challenge is rising anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic, anti-Arab bigotry, fear and hatred of immigrants. And on that score, that's going to require a much larger scale political effort. Yes, I'm saying that I believe the law enforcement community needs to keep one eye clearly focused on our domestic terrorists here while they devote the majority of their resources to the threat of foreign terrorism. But I'm also, and that's a job, we're not going to all go out and become junior FBI agents. We can do what we can do. But that's a law enforcement problem. But the problem of the Mike Savages of the world, of the Trent Lotts of the world, of anti-Semitism and people spewing bigotry and hatred, and on that note, I'll mention in closing the fight that we're going to see in this state, which is going to tear this state apart over the flag. I mean, those are the kinds of political issues where everyone can get involved, where everyone can and must be involved, because that is how we shape the tenor of democracy. The success or failure of hatred and racism and bigotry is not a function of what these groups do. Yes, they have strategies. Yes, they can be shrewd. Yes, they have access to the internet. Yes, they can finance their movement by selling racist CDs. But their success or failure is based more on what we do, on what people do in opposition to the hateful and divisive ideas that these social movements promote. And they are social movements. And that's another point of my book. That while you can look at them, if you choose to, as an agglomeration of disgruntled, psychologically maladjusted malcontents who are dangerous, you can choose that narrow frame to look at them. I choose a much broader frame to see that they are representative of broader undercurrents throughout society. They wouldn't have been with us ever since 1865, when the first domestic terrorist group in this country was created, the Ku Klux Klan. Aside from the domestic terrorism of slavery, which preceded that by several hundred years, they wouldn't have been with us through the Second World War, through the 1950s, through the Civil Rights Movement, through David Duke's resurgence in the 1990s when he ran for U.S. Senate in Louisiana and won 60% of the white vote. The majority of white people in Louisiana voted for a man who was the imperial wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, formerly the imperial wizard. They didn't vote for him in spite of the fact that he was the imperial wizard. They voted for him, in my view, because he stood for the kind of racism that he represented. And so these social movements wouldn't persist unless there was a base of ideas behind them. It's the ideas that matter. You all, I think, most of you, by coming here today and by looking at the crowd, I'm sure have different ideas. Don't keep those ideas to yourself. Go out and put them into action. Thank you very much.
I haven't got any cards right now, so I think what I want to do is just bring this mic around.
Can you hear me now?
It's working out, so I'll bring this mic around, and if anybody has a question, just raise your hand, and then let them use the mic, and I'll take it back and look for people with their hands raised and try to speed up the process.
And for those of you that may have to leave early, I understand there's different schedules, there's other things. I do have some of my books which are on sale at a discount there, and if you want me to sign them, if you hang around for a bit, I can come out and sign them, or feel free to buy one.
So. We did ask Mr. Levitt just to bring those books. He did not bring them on his own. We do this with authors who come who have interesting books, and I have a signed copy that I paid for, and that was earlier. So if you're interested in that, certainly we asked him to do that. So anyway, Carlos, you want to start off?
Yeah.
Carlos is a member of the History and Politics Club. In fact, he is the secretary. But go ahead.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your presentation a lot, and I have a couple of questions to ask you. The first one is in regard to survey that you mentioned, measuring anti-Semitic tendencies and the reliability of the test. First, question the reliability of the test.
Okay.
Secondly, the feel like the attitude of other that you made a good point about the attitudes of a segment of the population, in this case the white, or some members of the white population in the United States towards other ethnicities. But what, in your opinion, what do you think the tendencies of Jewish Americans towards blacks are? And thirdly, I'm sorry, how can one equate the notion that you put forward regarding anti-Semitism and the right in America with the fact that the Bush administration and conservative administrations in the United States tend to support strongly pro-Israeli policies?
Okay, let me try and deal with those quickly. The reliability of the survey on anti-Semitism. The Jewish community primarily became interested in trying to measure anti-Semitism early in around 1933, when Hitler was coming to power in Germany, polling as a social science was very crude back then, but there was some polling done during the war years, actually. In the post-war era, there were a lot of people, I mean, not just Jews, obviously, but psychologists, social psychologists, everybody was trying to understand kind of what went wrong in Germany, how did this happen, and there evolved a huge body of social science data where people were, and that people still debate today, trying to investigate this. But coming out of the war experience, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, there began to be a systematized set of questions that were developed to try and address anti-Semitism, measuring it. Just like there was a little bit later in the context of the civil rights movement, a lot of this work that Lawrence Bobo, I mentioned, refers to trying to measure, take the temperature on racism. This poll resides on 11 questions. And the one thing about it, I didn't talk to you about the trend data, but the 17% figure was from 2002. Prior to that, it had been 12%. Prior to that, it had been 20%. In other words, anti-Semitism had been going down steadily, historically, in the United States, from about a third to about a quarter to about 20% to about 10%. And that was really because older people who were raised in a more Christian America environment were basically dying off, removing themselves from the data set. Well, how reliable is this? Well, you're asking someone, you're calling them on the phone and saying, I'm going to ask you to make a series of statements, and you tell me, do you agree or disagree, yes or no. So first of all, if anything, it's under-reporting anti-Semitism, just like the polls about David Duke. We were calling in Louisiana, are you going to vote for David Duke, and people were saying no, no, no. And then when you got to the polls, you saw 60%. I mean, most people understand there's sort of some social convention against these kinds of beliefs, so they're not necessarily honest with the pollster. So if someone says, let me read these statements to you, Jews have too much power, yes or no, strongly agree, disagree, or so on. I mean, the standard data sample, it's about 1,000 Americans. If you read any other polling data about any other trend, you need about 1,000 Americans to get a reliable set. There's some questions in here which aren't perfect, like Jews stick together more than other Americans. I mean, one of the things we know about this is that some people look at that as a positive trait. Hey, I'm not being critical of you. Jewish community, it's well organized, so that's not a critical thing. But that's why I asked the 6 or more thing. I mean, you might disagree with 2 or 3 of these questions, but I would ask you, if you had a Jewish roommate or a Jewish friend and you met somebody in the street who says 6 or more of these things, you're going to bring that person home and introduce them, to your Jewish friend. You ask about the attitudes of Jews towards black Americans. It's a complicated issue, but Jews are, have been in the post-war era certainly socially constructed as white, and have benefited from, white skin privilege. And I'm not going to get into a long disquisition on black-Jewish relations and black-Jewish tensions, but certainly Jewish people are as susceptible to racism as are any other white people. Now, Jews tend to vote Democratic. There are only 2 groups in the country that vote Democratic as reliably. Only 2 groups that do so reliably, and that's Jews and blacks. There are only 20% of the Jewish community voted Republican in the last presidential election. It was actually 19. That was an all-time low. And Jews tend to be much more liberal on a range of social issues. But that doesn't mean they have a clean bill of health on racism. You talk about the African-American community. African-American community, there's significant tensions with the Latino community and communities of new immigrants where there are resentments about how is it that a population that was brought here in 1602 and landed in Jamestown, Virginia, and traded as human cargo for food. The first black people to come here have labored and struggled through slavery, through civil rights, through all these social movements and trends, and still the kind of segregation and discrimination exists. And then, the Asian community or the Latino community comes here, and the perception is that they're leapfrogging over the black community. That promotes all kinds of negative attitudes which the African-American community, Latino community, Asian community need to resolve. So just to say that someone's oppressed doesn't mean that they have a clean bill of health in their attitudes elsewhere. The Bush administration, their attitude towards Israel, that's a much broader thing that I could get into. But there are certainly segments of this country that are on the Republican right, who are, in my opinion, anti-Semitic, like Pat Robertson and the Christian Coalition and others, who support Israel. They support Israel because, according to their theological vision, you want to have Israel so that all the Jews can return to Israel, so Israel can be destroyed, so Christ can return. It's an apocalyptic vision based in Protestant dispensationalism, which goes back to the 19th century and so on. That doesn't answer your question about Bush, and I don't think Bush in particular has that theology, but Falwell and Robertson and much of the Christian right, also does. And I think the Jewish community is very heavily divided on this issue, and enters into an alliance with those on the Christian right, kind of at their peril.
Back here, I just wanted to get your opinion on the rise of xenophobia in a post-war United States. We've seen this time and time again, and now that we are in war, that we are going to see an increase in that type of mindset.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a mindset that's been it's been with us. It's been building, for many years. I think it's a function of it's a reaction to globalization. It's a reaction to increasing through technology, travel, other trends. It has become easier for people to come here. Some of it's also a function of the fact that, we used to have racist quotas for immigration, that, we would let in as many white Anglo-Saxon Christians from England and Ireland as wanted to come, but if people were non-white, there was a quota. They were explicitly Anglo-Saxon racial quotas for immigration. They were put in place in 1924. They were removed in 1964-65 as part of the civil rights movement. And part of what we're seeing today is a reaction to the removal of those racial quotas. it takes 10 or 20 years for the demographics of a population to shift and change. Everybody's obsessed with illegal immigration, illegal immigrants coming across the border from Mexico. The largest source of illegal immigration is people coming here and overstaying their visas. And many of them were from the former Soviet Union or from Ireland or from England or other northern European countries. Somehow nobody seems to get their bowels in an uproar about an invasion of Irishmen, washing dishes in pubs in the South End in Boston, but they seem to be very concerned about, Latinos on Buford Highway. I think the war environment, on your question, adds to it tremendously because what has happened is Arabs are seen as a security threat, and your average, to descend into pejoratives here, so excuse me, but your average anti-immigrant ignoramus does not distinguish between a Sikh wearing a turban on his head, who's not a Muslim, and a Muslim, and not that makes a Muslim any kind of a legitimate target. I don't know how many of you have been following this story. It's a shocking story. Luckily, they just made an arrest the day before yesterday, or 2 days ago in New York, of a guy who was going around. He killed 5 convenience store owners in New York, in Queens, shot them dead, went into the convenience store, took no money, was shown on a video camera, and the common denominator among all the convenience store clerks was that they were all non-white. Now, I don't think any of them were Arabs or Muslims, but some of them were East Asian or from other foreign countries, immigrants. And they found this guy, and he has some psychological issues going on, no doubt, but he testified that he was paranoid that after September 11th, he felt like he needed to kill Arabs and needed to kill Muslims. Now, we heard about the sniper as front page news. I think there were 11 people killed as a result of the sniper. That was front page news. Everybody knew about it. How many people here in this room, raise your hand, knew about these 5 killings over a period of 2 weeks in New York City? We are so inured to, these were racist hate crimes where someone was singling out folks based upon paranoia from September 11th. Finally, on that note, I think the degree to which the population goes in a fearful xenophobic direction or not is dependent on the messages they get from political leaders. And frankly, I haven't seen many Democrats and many liberals speaking out, embracing the importance and the value and the integrity of immigration. Instead, they're pandering to kind of the lowest common denominator of political outlook and thereby reinforcing it.
I have one from a card. It says, have you seen any evidence of collaboration between white supremacy groups and foreign or domestic Islamic terrorist groups?
Unfortunately not. And I say unfortunately not because I think Al-Qaeda is too smart to mess around with these guys. Not that some of them aren't smart or talented, as I mentioned, but anytime you bring disparate, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, yeah. And Billy Roper, the membership coordinator of the National Alliance, he said after September 11th, we may not want them marrying our daughters, those Arabs in the plains. We may not want them marrying our daughters, but anyone willing to fly a plane into a building to kill Jews is all right by me. I wish our members had half as much testicular fortitude. There's a lot of rhetorical common cause here, but I think if they tried to get together at the tactical level, that would just exponentially increase the possibility of some kind of leak somewhere. So I haven't seen that yet. Now in Europe, it's a different story. In Europe, we've seen, not necessarily with Al-Qaeda, but neo-Nazi terrorists in Britain going and trying to make common cause with Gaddafi in Libya. Actually, Gaddafi was too smart for him. He threw him out. But other kinds of things on the European scene, but not yet here in the United States. Yeah.
I have a question that might put me out there on the fringe a little bit. I'm one of those people who has a tremendous concern about the role of the media in promoting and inuring us to violence, the war as 24-hour-a-day entertainment, and also the role of video games and computer games and that kind of thing. I know there's a lot of stuff out there for playing terrorist, and I wonder how you feel about whether that really has an impact on how people perceive terrorism and how they get involved with it.
Well, the radical right is targeting young people with the internet, and it's a very effective tool from an economy point of view in order to reach audiences of young people. And I think we saw, with the Columbine shooting, that, young people are capable of, heinous acts of violence. At the same time, I think the media largely distorts the criminality of young people and has put us in a position of perceiving that violence by young people has reached epidemic proportions, whereas statistically, actually, violence by young people is on the decline or is holding steady. I'm not going to give you a sociological analysis about negative influences of TV and video games. Everyone has a different position on that. I mean, I think there is a desensitization. I certainly don't think it helps. I certainly don't think it's positive. But, what country in the world plays the most violent video games 24/7? Japan. And I don't see everybody running around in Japan, killing everyone. There's a lot of reasons why they don't do that. One of the reasons is they don't have any guns to do it. And in this country, we are awash in guns, and we have an attorney general who believes that the Second Amendment actually gives an individual a right to keep and bear arms when the Second Amendment doesn't grant an individual right to keep and bear arms. And we have an attorney general who is this close to the militia movement when it comes to his ideology about the kind of access that people should have to guns. But fundamentally, folks aren't going to they don't get recruited. My experience with skinheads, for example, is they are not recruited and drawn into the movement solely because of the violence and the nihilism of it. It's the ideas, it's the ideology, and that's really the more dangerous element of it. If you want to look at the real relationship between violence and right-wing terrorism, look at the Army. That's not a video game. Okay? We take millions of people every year. We train them to be killers. That's what they're supposed to do, and you know, when you need them, you want to have them. But when they become psychologically unstable or politically unpleasant, like what's his name, Muhammad or Malvo, who's, you know, hasn't been convicted yet, but I'll lay money that he's probably the sniper, you know, Gulf War veteran, or Timothy McVeigh, you know, Gulf War veteran. That I'm not blaming the hate crimes and the violence of the neo-Nazi movement on the U.S. military, but we have seen skinheads recruiting in the military. We've seen murders in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, carried out by enlisted men. And in the United States Army today, the rule is that you can be a member of a neo-Nazi white supremacist group and a member of the U.S. Armed Forces. You just cannot actively recruit for that group while you're a member of the U.S. Armed Forces. I'm a believer in the First Amendment, freedom of association, and the Constitution. I also know that you suspend all kinds of constitutional rights when you join the Army. You suspend your right to freedom of speech. You can't tell your sergeant to bug off, and you can't say, no, I'm not going to go drop to the ground and do 50 push-ups because I disagree with you. And I do not believe that members of the armed forces, enlisted servicemen and personnel, should be allowed. I think if you discover that they are a member of a neo-Nazi hate group, that they should be given a dishonorable discharge. That's just an accident waiting to happen. Yeah.
In the post-Oklahoma City period, there were persistent rumors, and they come up periodically again, that there was a direct connection between Saddam Hussein and the incident in Oklahoma City, that it involved underwriting the effort. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a right-wing conspiracy that has its origins directly in folks who are sympathetic to the militia movement. And it got, unfortunately, additional steam and momentum once we started, you know, this process of going to war against Iraq. And then it began to resurface and in other places, like the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, where people began to hint that maybe this had the fingerprints, you know, of Iraq. And there were all kinds of crazy theories that were spun out that Terry Nichols met in the Philippines with Islamicists from Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. There is absolutely, and the individuals behind this theory, first of all, you had Stephen Jones, who was McVeigh's defense lawyer. And, you know, Jones's job was to get McVeigh off. Well, he didn't succeed. But as a defense lawyer, it was his job to blow and throw as much smoke as he possibly could at the jury and everyone else. So he spun these theories out, create reasonable doubt. You know, McVeigh might not really be the one here. There might be a whole shadowy network of people behind him. Maybe even the United States government was involved because, you know, Janet Rito and the Justice Department did kill 58 innocent people in Waco, and there were 17 children in Waco. And if you have a government that's willing to kill innocent people in Waco, why wouldn't they kill 168 people in Oklahoma City? And, those were the kinds of theories, and that was the rhetoric. And once Stephen Jones put that out in court, well, then the press reported that the defense lawyer said this and that. And then once things get reported into the media, they take on an aura of, well, maybe is this true? One of the things feeding that is the reality that we don't know if they got everyone who was responsible for Oklahoma City. McVeigh and Nichols, we know they got. There might have been one or two other guys who were out there, living in Mexico, who got away. I'm not someone who's going to assert definitively that McVeigh and Nichols were the only ones involved, but I think that the part of the impetus to blame Saddam or Islamic terrorists derives from the same kind of a denial that, hey, our guys can do this on their own, thank you very much. They have enough racial hatred of the government to go out and do this. They don't need to be bankrolled or inspired by anyone. Second of all, this thing didn't cost them but pennies, to carry this out. They didn't need money from anyone. And thirdly, it stems from this desire to, blame Arabs for everything. And so I don't countenance those theories at all.
At what point do you, just get your opinion on this, at what point do you think the government considers a group or a person a terrorist? Do they just have to be like Muslim or?
Well, that's a very good point. There is you can go onto the FBI website and look at what the definition of a terrorist is, and you can look at some FBI reports on terrorism. According to the FBI, the most dangerous terrorist group in America today is the Animal Liberation Front. You know, now there are groups of animal rights activists and environmentalists. You know, they set fire to a ski lodge in Aspen and did like $60 million worth of damage. They didn't kill anyone, but they damaged a lot of property. And so according to the FBI, you know, that's a number one domestic terrorist threat. On the other hand, guys that go out and kill abortion doctors and blow up abortion clinics, they're not considered domestic terrorists. I mean, the definition of a domestic terrorist is someone who uses force and violence in pursuit of a political agenda or to force social concessions or political concessions. That's why Muhammad and Malvo or the snipers, you know, that was not terrorism. It terrorized everyone, but they weren't making any political demands. They didn't have any vision of society, you know, that we know of that they were trying to transform. But Eric Rudolph, you know, blowing up the abortion clinic allegedly in Birmingham, bombing the Other Side Lounge, gay and lesbian bar here in Atlanta, and bombing the Olympics, you know, that was an act of political terrorism. Did the FBI call it domestic terrorism? No. Did they assign it to their domestic terrorism unit? No. You know, these things are politically malleable. It's not, no, if you're an Arab, you know, you're a terrorist. But there has been, sadly, before Oklahoma City, kind of a hesitancy to really regard these groups as the threat that they are. Now that they're out there killing cops and talking about blowing up government buildings, and they blew up government buildings, I think law enforcement has a greater appreciation that these guys are domestic terrorists. But sometimes that doesn't translate in the official policy realm as concretely as it should, nor does it trickle down as heavily to local FBI agents, you know, as is necessary.
A couple more questions, perhaps, then we can go eat. I'll start with one from a card. A person asks, a significant number of crimes have occurred based on gender and gender identity. Why is this form of discrimination and terrorism not as widely discussed and combated? Have you done any research on this topic?
Well, gender identity is, I mean, that I would separate clearly from issues of crimes related to people based upon gender, or I would define, if you're talking with regard to gender identity, murders of transvestites or transsexuals or attacks on gay or lesbian people. There were a series of crimes here in Atlanta on the West End, which I don't think they were ever solved. I remember when I first moved here in '89 that there were 8 or 10 transvestite prostitutes, you know, that were found murdered in the West End, and Atlanta police never found who was doing it. That issue, you know, hate crimes against gays and lesbians or people because of their sexual orientation or people who are perceived as sexually deviant, there's a lot of research on that. There's a lot of work being done on that. There's lots of groups that are working on that issue. I am not an expert on that. I don't claim to know that area very well. We try and specialize to some degree, you know, dealing with various aspects of the hate movement and hate groups. Neither am I an expert in the anti-abortion bombers. There's some people who devote their entire time to just tracking that kind of segment of the movement. Now, the first part of the question, hate crimes against people based upon gender, and the larger issue of misogyny in society and the levels of domestic violence or sexual assault, and how those are linked to socially constructed ideas about women, and how when women act out against what are perceived to be socially prescribed roles as subservient to men, then that then makes them a legitimate target for violence, or even if they're not acting out, that you just socially, there's a level of violence against women as part of an element of social control, just like there has been a level of violence against black people as a measure and a tool of social control. I think there's a lot of research, again, that has been done about that. There's debate about whether or not to include, you know, gender as a class in hate crime legislation and how to classify that. Some states include gender in hate crime legislation, other states don't. And I think that's really a function of debate, because if you included gender as a hate crime, you'd be prosecuting thousands and thousands and thousands of people for hate crimes, and that would create all other kinds of social difficulties for the legal system that we're not prepared to engage in. Be happy to visit with anybody afterwards.
Right. Right. Maybe you ought to ask that question. Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, if there are no more questions, Jenny, do you want to finish up?
We have some food outside, so if you guys want to partake in that, you're welcome to. And I just want to thank Mr. Levis again for coming. Thank you.